Hello guys and welcome back. The Dark Tower was actually supposed to be Stephen King's biggest cinematic universe, but instead it ended up becoming a 95-minute warning about what happens when Hollywood tries to squeeze an entire multiverse into one single movie. Stephen King's The Dark Tower was an unprecedented experiment that united the genres of fantasy, westerns, horror, and science fiction, and connected numerous previous King characters and works in one go. The 2017 movie adaptation seemed to be the beginning of a new Hollywood franchise, starring Idris Elba as Roland Deschain, Matthew McConaughey as the Man in Black, and backed by Sony. Instead, it ran for 95 minutes, faced critical backlash, made $113 million at the global box office, and killed the would-be franchise dead in its tracks. So how did years of development, numerous rewrites, and one of King's greatest works lead to such a disappointment? Let's find out. Adapting Stephen King's books is a difficult endeavor because each of his stories has extremely unique scenarios and events. The Dark Tower is not an exception to the rule, as it became one of the most hyped works by King to be turned into a movie. The Gunslinger was first published as a book in 1982, but King began writing the material around 1970. The original 7-book cycle concluded in 2004, and The Wind Through the Keyhole, a later interquel, was published in 2012. The series describes the journey of the main character, Roland Deschain, who seeks to reach the Dark Tower to save all the worlds. However, this world is definitely not a fairy tale kingdom. The realm that Roland knows is a bizarre blend of Western, dark fantasy, post-apocalyptic science fiction, and horror genres. The author also incorporated some elements of horror and science fiction into the story in order to expand the context of the book. It is also worth mentioning that The Dark Tower is part of King's fictional universe, which includes such works as The Stand, Salem's Lot, and It. Roland Deschain is a character who is hard to describe briefly, as he is one of the most realistic characters created by King. The man is short-tempered, single-minded, and secretive, yet he is determined to achieve his goal regardless of all the obstacles. Additionally, he is willing to do anything to accomplish what he wants, which makes his character incredibly fascinating and terrifying. Overall, the major challenge that the adapters had to face was to find a way to condense all the events and the complex storyline of The Dark Tower into a single movie, or even a movie series. Hollywood producers and directors struggled with this task for a long time. Even before its planned theatrical release in 2017, The Dark Tower was offered several times to different film producers. The series had gained such popularity among readers that numerous companies wanted to adapt the book series into a movie. For example, in 2007, J.J. Abrams' film production company Bad Robot acquired the rights to King's The Dark Tower. Since Lost, the television series co-created by Abrams and Lindelof, was widely watched by its audience and depicted plenty of mysterious and supernatural elements similar to those in The Dark Tower. Everyone was expecting great things from the adaptation. Moreover, Lindelof, being a big fan of King, was not only cooperating with him on the movie project, but was also actively participating in the adaptation process. However, as usual, it was not an easy path for filmmakers to create an adaptation that would satisfy both the author and movie viewers. Thus, despite active participation in the project, Lindelof later admitted in an interview that his reverence for King made him hesitant to take the creative license needed for the adaptation. Finally, in 2009, Abrams and Lindelof decided to step away from the project. The reason for this failure was not a lack of interest in the movie, contrary to common opinion. In fact, the opposite situation occurred. However, the filmmakers found the scale of the project intimidating after years spent making Lost. After J.J. Abrams' interpretation of The Dark Tower, the production team started working on a new adaptation of the series. This time, the plans were much more ambitious than before. Thus, in 2010, director Ron Howard, producer Brian Grazer, and writer Akiva Goldsman announced their intention to make a movie out of King's work. Moreover, the idea included both cinema and television. According to Howard and Grazer, there should be 3 films and 2 TV miniseries. The films would follow Roland Deschain and his way to the Dark Tower, while the TV series would tell different stories from the books and give more screen time to other characters. It was a good idea to leave the major story for the films and introduce viewers to other intriguing plots and protagonists via a television series. It would certainly be more time and effort consuming than making just a couple of movies. However, it could provide a more comprehensive adaptation of the book. Universal Pictures became interested in the idea, thus making the financing of such an expensive project feasible. That is why the new adaptation of The Dark Tower became closer than ever. The production team managed to persuade even Javier Bardem to play Roland Deschain. Nevertheless, it was the same idea which seemed so great that led to the failure of the project. The plan required Universal Pictures to invest a lot of money in the already expensive films, which seemed like too much for the company. Thus, the plan called for not only one film but 3 movies and television installments before the first one was released. It was too much to take care of at once, which is why Universal decided not to move forward with the project in 2011. The most promising adaptation of The Dark Tower, which seemed to have too many great ideas, failed. Ironically, the very idea that caused it to emerge was the reason for its failure. It was too ambitious and asked too much of the company, which actually made it impossible to create a movie out of King's books. This way, the initial plan of making 3 films and 2 TV miniseries was a bit too greedy, which eventually led to The Dark Tower's adaptation being abandoned. The project that was supposed to adapt the whole book series turned out to be the one that, in the end, did not deliver any actual result. Even after Universal walked away, The Dark Tower didn't remain abandoned. Warner Brothers later explored its own version, but that attempt also eventually failed to reach production. By 2015, Sony Pictures and MRC had taken over the project and moved forward with a new approach. Their approach to creating a movie was different, since they did not plan to release various media resources at once, but focused first on preparing a single theatrical film. Nikolai Arcel was invited to direct, and he managed to cast 3 main actors: Idris Elba as Roland Deschain, Matthew McConaughey as the Man in Black, and Tom Taylor as Jake Chambers. However, this approach to making the film had problems, since it had to carry out many functions at once. It had to tell the audience about Roland Deschain, Jake Chambers, the Man in Black, Midworld, the Tower, the Doors, telepathy, the monsters, and much more. It had to provide a beginning and end, as well as introduce the audience to a world so rich in all kinds of adventures, and prepare the way for a future film. The most problematic part was that the creators did not simply adapt one of King's books, instead presenting the film as a continuation of Roland's adventure and changing parts of the story. For example, in the movie, Roland has the Horn of Eld, a detail that signals a new iteration of his quest after the novels. On the one hand, the release of this film could be perceived by moviegoers as an opportunity to get to know a new world and meet fantastic heroes. On the other hand, it could feel like false advertising for those who were waiting for the release of an adaptation of the book. The film couldn't satisfy either the first or the second group. The movie neither fully explained the world nor introduced the characters in sufficient detail. The major problem with the Dark Tower movie is its brevity. Since it only comprises around 95 minutes, it had to contain a fairly complicated story that had been written over thousands of pages and presented in a series of books. However, instead of following the first volume, The Gunslinger, and developing a plot around the character of Roland Deschain and his quest, the film takes elements from all parts of the series. As a result, viewers needed to understand who Jake was, who Walter the Man in Black was, what the Dark Tower and Midworld were, what psychic children and interdimensional portals were, and how these elements were related and affected each other in only 95 minutes. In fact, the first element of the story that had to be cut was the complex nature of Walter's personality. His role in the narrative seemed to be reduced to providing a supernatural rival for Roland. In addition, it was hard to empathize with Jake, the window to the Dark Tower world, since his story arc was also minimized. As for Walter, despite the actor being charming, he was not as mysterious as King wanted the character to be. In general, the entire history of Midworld seemed to be cut short, although the region was supposed to be ancient, wondrous, mysterious, and dangerous. Stephen King himself acknowledged this problem, noting that the series' length was a disadvantage. It had to be cut to fit the movie's time frame, and he criticized the adaptation's choice to change the book's potentially adult-oriented content to something suitable for teenagers. It appears that the Dark Tower's adaptation was problematic not because it changed the source material, but because it changed too much. In fact, any alteration to the original work could be viewed as a problem when talking about adaptations. However, in the case of the Dark Tower movie, changes were inevitable due to the series' vastness and the film's limited running time. As a result, the adaptation failed because it had too much to say in too little time, and it could not say it all properly. There was another problem with The Dark Tower that had nothing to do with the amount of information that had to be cut or squeezed in order to fit all the necessary elements into a 95-minute film. The entire point of King's universe was altered in order to make it more appealing to the general viewer. The books have copious amounts of gore, misery, drama, shady adventures, and other elements that are not exactly found in light, family-friendly movies. Roland Deschain's world is one of pervasive desolation, and even the most virtuous characters often resort to despicable acts. The 2017 Dark Tower movie was made as a PG-13 movie, and that decision came with its own issues. However, The Dark Tower suffered tremendously from this particular choice, as much of the violence and other mature material had to be toned down to reach a broader, younger audience. In fact, one cannot expect a PG-13 fantasy film with a lone gunslinger as the main character to retain every fundamental concept that defines The Dark Tower. It became a typical fantasy blockbuster that could have been seen in the cinema several decades ago, with the addition of an assumedly vast nature of the series that only made it look more confusing and unapproachable. On the other hand, it was not dark enough for the mature Stephen King fans who were disappointed with the film, as the 2017 movie was supposed to be something more grown up. Stephen King himself has commented on the Dark Tower movie's rating issues. He argued that the PG-13 approach made it difficult to preserve the book's darker and more violent material. There was one aspect in which the Dark Tower was right about casting its actors. Idris Elba was the perfect choice to embody Roland Deschain. His presence gave the required weight to the character, simultaneously conveying the internal and external aspects of the hero, the steely determination and the troubled mind haunted by ghosts of the past. If the role had been written better, an actor like Elba could have surprised us with even more depth in his performance. Another actor who was a good fit for the role was Matthew McConaughey. His natural charisma allowed him to embody Walter as a seductive and predatory man in black, yet he failed due to the predictability of the character, which was to a great extent defined by the script, since his image as a heartthrob is too familiar for the position he was offered. And indeed, in the portrayal of Walter, McConaughey relied too much on the traits common to movie and book villains, while the image of Walter in the book is much more complex and multi-sided. The same criticism can be applied to the portrayal of Roland. The book made him a very intriguing character, driven by the desire to reach the Dark Tower and haunted by the memories of his past life, which affected all aspects of his personality. Due to the limitations of the movie adaptation, his role was significantly narrowed and his motivation seemed much simpler than in the book, an all-consuming vengeance against Walter. Jake's role was not given nearly enough exposure. The relationship between him and Roland was one of the most emotional threads in the entire book, yet only a few viewers might remember it after watching the movie. It seems that the filmmakers tried to minimize the time spent on their interaction by rushing the plot. Therefore, blaming the actors for the failure of The Dark Tower seems unfair. Both Idris Elba and Matthew McConaughey delivered performances in line with the opportunities provided to them. And as far as opportunities are concerned, they were limited by the quality of the script. Later in interviews, Elba acknowledged that the film had been poorly reviewed and said he did not think they would make more, whereas Goldsman openly expressed regret about how the entire venture turned out. Thus, in conclusion, it must be said that The Dark Tower might have had the actors to carry a project of such magnitude, but not the script to truly realize their potential. The Dark Tower was not a failure in terms of its opening position, as it debuted in first place at the box office. Yet it was not a success, as the sum of money earned was not enough to fund another film in the series. The movie earned about $19 million in its domestic opening weekend, which was modest for a potential blockbuster. It eventually made around $50.7 million domestically and $113 million worldwide, and had a budget between $60 million and $66 million. This result was not considered strong enough for a would-be franchise starter. Sony Pictures and MRC expected to base a profitable franchise on The Dark Tower to get additional revenue from the sequel. Yet the underwhelming response to the movie did not encourage the producers to continue working on the project. The Dark Tower greatly disappointed critics, which is reflected in its 16% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. Reasons for such a low mark included the lack of emotional involvement, although some of the reviewers also mentioned the misplaced pacing generic storyline, and narrative confusion. This result did not help the sequel prospects, as the first film in the series only achieved moderate popularity at the box office. The Dark Tower movie was not able to achieve the popularity needed for the funding of the following films in the series. Critics stated that it failed to emotionally engage viewers. Longtime fans of the book series were disappointed by the attempt to simplify the storyline, while new viewers did not understand it. The failure of the Dark Tower movie in 2017 was not going to stop the attempts to adapt Stephen King's eponymous book series into another media format. Sony and MRC were ready to consider other ways to capitalize on the property, so they turned their attention to another most viable direction: television. Even before the film's release, there were already ideas to develop a TV series that would explore the lore and characters that were not going to be covered due to the movie's constraints. Eventually, Amazon took on the project, which was to be a separate property connected to the Dark Tower. Its showrunner, Glenn Mazzara, intended for it to depict a young Roland Deschain, so it was to be largely based on the novel Wizard and Glass, which chronicles the gunslinger's youth. The separate adaptation was to serve as a much-needed prequel to the original work, as well as being truer to it than the 2017 movie ever was. Although Amazon took on the project in 2018 and later ordered a pilot, the project was cancelled in 2020, with no official explanation ever given. Thus, it would be unfair to blame the movie's failure for Amazon's decision. But even after the movie and the Amazon pilot failed, Hollywood still wasn't ready to give up on Roland's journey. After several failures and one underwhelming film adaptation, The Dark Tower may finally be finding its way to the screens. Unlike the 2017 film, the latest project is aiming to be a long-form television series. In 2022, filmmaker Mike Flanagan announced the development of a new adaptation of The Dark Tower. He has even been quoted as saying that The Dark Tower was his dream project, and he managed to write the pilot and outline the season's plot. However, Mike Flanagan's plan for The Dark Tower does not end with the first season, as he has discussed a long-term plan involving 5 seasons, followed by 2 feature films. He has already directed several adaptations of the writer's books, including Gerald's Game, Dr. Sleep, and The Life of Chuck. So if anyone knows how to handle Stephen King's work, it is most definitely Mike Flanagan. However, it would be unwise to overestimate the filmmaker's plans for The Dark Tower. Even though they are undeniably perfect for the original works and have the potential to restore the legacy of King's creation, there is a very real possibility they will never see the light of day. Firstly, unlike the film adaptations, there is no confirmed release date for either the TV series or the films. As of August 2023, there is still no confirmed release date or announced cast. In January 2026, Flanagan said the project was moving forward, with a lot of scripts already completed and The Dark Tower his first priority. The Dark Tower, then, is a victim of Hollywood's inability to truly comprehend the magnitude of the author's work. It was not that it was impossible to adapt, but that the 2017 movie tried to make too much of it fit into a single film when it most certainly did not want to. The Dark Tower is one of the most surprising failures of a multimedia franchise that could have been a major Hollywood success. Stephen King's legacy, the book's popularity, the deep world and characterful nature of the story, and the potential for a massive fantasy universe were all there. But the very attributes that made the book so weird and mid-paced proved to be a challenge to adapt to film. The 2017 film tried to do the impossible by focusing on an all-encompassing Stephen King opus, while also managing to make it a brief PG-13 launchpad for a new franchise. As such, the film failed to satisfy anyone. The story was too dumbed down for the fans, while at the same time, newcomers felt insufficiently introduced to the world. It can only be hoped that with this new adaptation, the filmmaker will manage to deliver the long-awaited adaptation for the general audience. However, if Hollywood fails once again to understand the formula for success, it will lose the opportunity to make a truly great project. So, do you think The Dark Tower can still become the franchise fans have always wanted? Or is Roland's journey simply too big and too strange for Hollywood to ever get it right?